Good morning. For a few reasons that might become obvious, decided to talk about right effort or perfect effort this time round. And I've kind of subtitled it, Knowing Wholesome and Unwholesomeness. Prajna is insight to emptiness or wisdom. Paramita is translated as that which has reached the other shore or transcends. And then I recently found a quote or something Red Pine had written in his introduction to his latest book, and I don't remember the name of the book. Prajna Paramita. This way, it's a teaching that points to our mind before we learn how to divide the indivisible. And I found that, and I thought this is kind of fitting where I'm going with this today. So talking about right effort, and I'm going to involve a story. It's a personal story, and it sort of connects. I like the connection I'm making, and I hope you can stretch far enough to see where I'm going with it. All day long, we are busy at doing this dividing. Every time words, thoughts, whatever, it separates us from what we're doing. I would like to think that we come here to work at disabusing ourselves, come here at this place, disabusing ourselves of doing this deluding activity. In fact, coming here, I think, is right effort to start with. It's the sixth of the Eightfold Noble Path, grouped with mindfulness and concentration. This is the part of the Eightfold Path that we think of as mind training. But I'm going to extend that a little bit to the efforts we use every day. Simply, it means to go towards that which is wholesome and away from that which is unwholesome. To actively consider and engage in what this means, right effort is broken down into the 4 exertions or restraints. About a year ago, I'm sorry my voice it seems to be getting worse right now, but I'll try and hope it doesn't abandon me.
It's kind of Tom Waits like that back, so we appreciate it.
Oh, good. Because I'm not calm, right? About a year ago, I think it was February 21st, in fact, Hoko gave a talk. We were doing the Zoomies then, and of course, and it was on I think it was the 56th gate of Dharma illumination, of the 108 gates of Dharma illumination, roughly on right effort, but more on the 4 exertions or restraints. And the first of the 4 exertions is to make the effort to prevent unwholesome qualities from finding purchase. This is the initial restraint. This is kind of like you, as you practice, this is your practice. This is what we do. This is recognizing that we already have within us that intuition, that gut feeling, that feeling of Dharma in us. It's our insight into emptiness. It's the present, and we just know this. Number 2 is abandoning or extinguishing the thoughts and behaviors that are unwholesome and keep one bound to delusive thinking and action. This is pretty obvious. It happens all the time when we sit. Our monkey mind takes hold and we start going all over the place and start having arguments with other people and ourselves. It's really the active practice of our day as Buddhists, I think. We know in our guts that this is the action which will cause suffering in some way, so we're kind of ahead of it, hopefully. Intuitions and gut feelings aside, how can we describe unwholesomeness another way? It's all good to know that it's broken down into the 5 hindrances. This is all part of Buddhist studies. Hoko touched on this stuff. I'm going to go there again because I think it's good to do this stuff. The first is sensual desire. These are, I also like to look at these as like the before the 5 distractions. They're all in the same category, I think. The 5 distractions are food, money, power, sex, and sleep. And these somewhat overlap, but it's in the same place, the places that stop us or divert us. Sensual desire can be anything that gives us physical pleasure. Sex, obviously, but there's other things like silk jammies and hot bath, things you like to eat. If you, and I know you get into the recovery end of things in your practice, and the seesaw of the dopamine and the, I don't know, what's the other side, gremlins, they call them sometimes. So the dopamine and the gremlins. Anything that gives you a little dopamine, gives you a little rush there. We're always kind of looking for ways to get high. The problem happens is when you must have this, when you must have this thing, this sex, this alcohol, this whatever it is, that's addiction. Anything, I just said that, anything that jacks up the dopamine response. We're caught in our desires, lust of one kind or another. Each of these 5 hindrances has an antidote of sorts. With sensorial desire, one can meditate on death, impermanence, the foulness of the body process. The second hindrance is ill will or anger. The antidote here, as we know, is love and compassion. The third is sloth, torpor, laziness. I've never really known the real definition of torpor. I mean, you can it kind of sounds like what it is, but I finally went to Webster's, and it's just basically extreme sluggishness or stagnation. There we are with dukkha again, being stuck. When we find ourselves here, we can turn to something that excites us, cultivate an interest, or perhaps just get up and move, go outside, take a hike, do something like that. The fourth is restlessness and worry. We all do this one, and I think I've already mentioned it's basically monkey mind. If you do sesshin here, or if you sit for any long periods, or just take the time to notice what's going on, we do a whole lot of time doing that. I found myself this morning worrying about whether or not I'd paid a bill. and had to go filing through my desk while I was trying to get here, you know. So just things like that that are constantly capturing us. It's how we control or try to control, make an effort to control everything that's around us. It's a lack of impulse control. We like to be entertained every second, and anymore we all have cell phones, and we all know what that does to us. My wife and I found each other at the breakfast table last weekend. Both of us, our phones out, checking the news on, Ukraine and everything else. Kind of being taken away by it for a while, till we both kind of looked up and noticed that we were doing this, chided each other. To counter this, we really do need to examine what the particular gremlin of anxiety is doing to us. We can turn them off, put them away, but it's important to notice it. The counter to this, the antidote to this, is if we can find contentment with simply being in the moment. Maybe monkey mind will get off our backs. The fifth of the 5 hindrances is self-doubt or inconfidence. This can be paralyzing and is probably generated out of sheer confusion, which we can allow ourselves to see through this. I think one needs to cultivate a patience and trust, and to foster a curiosity in all things. Just investigate. The other thing to remember is that these hindrances are really the fodder for our practice too. They aren't going away. And practice, as hard as it is and as enticing as all these things are, it's good to just remember that this is where we work. These are the points. These are the pivot points. And then we move back onto the 4 exertions. And number 3 of these is to develop and cultivate wholesome qualities. So 1 and 2 is to, first of all, be in a space where the unwholesome qualities don't even enter. Secondly is to abandon them when you see them. And then third is to develop and cultivate the wholesome qualities in our lives, all the things that keep us on track. We can think of kind acts and every opportunity we can engage to make things better, make every moment better. Or just serve one another. I think that's a good way to step into it. Notice when you're holding a door open or you're loaning something that somebody needs, feeding people. And the fourth, the last of the 4 exertions, maintaining and preserving. That's where our effort and our practice comes in. Now I'm going to ask you to hold on to this dichotomy of wholeness and unwholesomeness. This is kind of an inspirational story. It's inspirational for me. It's mostly out of my childhood into my young adulthood. From the time I was 6 or 7, until he died when I was in my mid-30s, Sam was my father's best friend. He was a physically small guy, maybe 5'7", 145 pounds, sinewy, weathered, looking around with kind of a half grin constantly. He smoked constantly. Dad and he met while working together for a local contractor where I grew up in Lafayette. My dad was a remodeler, a carpenter, kind of a jack of all trades. Sam was kind of the same way. I think they instantly became friends. And for all the years I can remember, we camped with Sam and his girlfriend. I worked with Sam and Dad on jobs after Dad went into business on his own. And Sam and Dad hunted together, which is my connection to Bloomington, actually, because when they started to come down here to hunt in the forest, they got to know a guy on my road. His name was Haskell Grogan. Haskell owned quite a few acres at the end of the road, Sewell Road, just before it became state forest. And as they got to be friendly with Haskell, Sam and Dad asked Haskell if he wouldn't mind selling off some of the property. And they stepped off what they thought was an acre and ended up being over 2 acres. And then proceeded to build a small frame cabin on it, a place to stay and a place for our family to vacation. This place eventually became my house. One of my profound memories about Sam, and I hadn't mentioned this yet, Sam had a peg leg. It was wooden. It was like a table leg, and it had a rotating base to it. And it was from his knee on down, and it was always straight. And I was, of course, when I was a little kid, I was really fascinated by this. And he was such a good-natured fellow, little kid. And I heard him do this several times. Ask him, wow, what happened to your leg? And he always said, an alligator bit it off. And so, my curiosity was always there about this fascinating one-legged guy and the one leg itself and what happened to it. Okay, to move on. What was most fascinating was how he negotiated the world. He managed really well. The guy drove a manual shift, after all, I mean, if you can imagine. And he was good at it. So, and he hiked the woods and forests, and he, working with my dad, he was often the guy that was crawling around in the crawl spaces, installing the heating ducts and running wires and things like that. And he was great at it. What was particularly amazing was when we were building the cabin, the hunting cabin, which became my house. I was maybe a sophomore in high school, and so I would come down and I'd help. And I remember that entire floor being framed and Sam walking on the joist. His leg would come out, and he wasn't even looking. He was just gone, and I was just amazed at that. I mean, he's just completely in tune with his situation. The other wonderful thing about Sam was he was ever kind and generous, very soft-spoken. He had a lot of wonderful, simple, sagely things to say, just observations. Everybody needs somebody like this in their life, especially when you're a kid. I never saw him angry or upset, and he was often a buffer between me and my father's abuses to me, my dad was really tough to work with. And he would sometimes just kind of step in and say, he's got it. He understands what you're, he was always there as a way to not butt heads so much with my dad. I was always glad when he was around. And in general, he seemed pretty content with his life. Now, at one point in my early 20s, Dad and I were driving around. We were between jobs and just talking about everything. And I can't remember how it came up, but we got on the subject of Sam. Sam at that point was retired, so he wasn't around with us as much. And I finally got the story about his leg, what happened there. When he was 20 years old, in 1928, he and a friend of his, a fellow named John Burns, robbed a restaurant in West Point, Indiana, which was very close to where I grew up. I went to high school with kids in West Point, and tiny town, but a nice place. They both got away with $65, meaning between them they got away with $65. It was armed robbery. They were both caught a few days later. Tried to get away. They managed to get them, put them in jail. I think they spent about 4 or 5 days in jail. And while they were there, well, I'll come to this later. I think a few weeks later, there was a trial. Things happened a little faster back then. They were both sentenced to 5 to 21 years at, I think it's called, at that time it was called the Pendleton Reformatory. I think it's just called the Pendleton Prison now. It's over near Pendleton, Indiana. And the day came that they were to be transferred from jail to the reformatory, and there were 2 guards that were responsible for this transfer process. And as the story goes, it was an old Studebaker. I think it was a 1920 Studebaker is what they talk about. They were taking them into the reformatory inn. While they were in jail, they somehow got a hold of a gun each. It's hard to understand this, but apparently somehow gun got through, slipped to them. On the way to jail, they shot and killed both the guards, shot in the back of the head and in the back. And then they disposed of the bodies near a forest, somewhere near Covington, Indiana, near the Illinois border, somewhere in a field, I guess, or right next to a wood. Then they went on the lam. Apparently, John Burns went to Louisiana. I think the story is he went to Monroe, Louisiana, worked as a laborer for a couple of weeks. He was originally from West Lafayette. His mother still lived there. He just couldn't stand it. He was homesick. He came home. Somehow the word got out that he was back, and they took him in. They found him, took him in, and he said that he was happy for it. He was happy to not be on the lam and to be going through this. And he made up a story how some guys from Chicago came down that were part of their gang or something and helped dispose, actually killed the 2 guards. It later came out that that wasn't the actual story. Sam managed to get away, and he ended up in New Mexico. got a job as a person building water towers, and got married, had a child, and about 3 years later, after the robbery, his brother-in-law read these detective magazines, and there was a big article on there about the thing that John and Sam did. So the brother-in-law turned him in for the reward money. The authorities came down, they found him. He started to run. He was shot in the leg, and they tied a tourniquet on his leg. And then they flew him to Indiana with a tourniquet on his leg. That's how he lost his leg. After he was brought back, of course. He had to go through another trial. Ended up getting life in prison. Ended up going to Michigan City, where the prison was, state prison. And that is the exact place that John Burns ended up. This happened in January of 1932. He spent 15 years in prison. He was released for good behavior on Christmas Eve, whatever 15 years after 1932 is. It's really hard to close that gap between those two people that I knew. The fellow I grew up with, my dad's best friend, he was my best friend too. And the fellow that did this. There's the entire story is in a book by an Indiana author. Gosh, I can't think of his name now. The title of the book is Notorious 92, and he basically goes through all of the 92 counties in Indiana and writes about the most notorious murder or crime that happened. And I was in Barnes and Nobles when it was still here, and they had an Indiana section, and I saw that, and it just, maybe that's in there, and sure enough it was. So it was a little different. This whole story is a little different than what I heard, but I had always wanted to tell this story somehow, if not just to kind of release Sam in a way. Draw that distinction between unwholesome and wholesome, and how much it's in both of us, how extreme it was in this fellow. So that's what I have today. I also want to end with, I just want to tell people that there's something that Hoko and I have been talking about for a long time, about expanding our service, and it will probably happen maybe sometime this year, maybe this fall. Sundays will become a little different. Not necessarily for those of you who want to show up and sit for the talk, but we're thinking about doing a couple of periods in the morning, starting at 5, then having breakfast, and then having a work period. And then, well, maybe at the end of our 2 periods of sitting, we'd have service. And this would be pretty much a full service. So it would include what we do, Heart Sutra, Daishin Dharani. There's a couple of other things. I'm not sure if the Daishin Dharani's in. Names of the Buddha. I want to encourage folks to come and see what this is like, see what it's about. It's, when you chant it's all about bringing your mind, body, spirit together in one place and chanting. And there's something wonderful about the whole thing. If you have a bunch of crap going on in your life, it kind of falls to the wayside when you do this. So I'm going to end with that. Ask if there are any questions here, any comments. Anything out in the gallery? Sawyer.
Thanks for sort of bringing us into your world there. That was really wonderful to hear these kind of intimate Hosshin growing up and that gap between wholesome and unwholesome, activities, actions, that can be so extreme. I wonder if you can say a little bit more about the gap and maybe how you imagine that gap from unwholesome to wholesome, hopefully, happening in Sam or in anyone. How does that unfold?
I think we begin with a kind of awareness. We sit in this practice and watch what our minds do to start with. And I remember a previous teacher, Yo-Yo Anderson, up in Monroe, Wisconsin, talking about going to, I think it was her daughter's grade school, and giving a talk to the class and trying to describe Dharma. And the way she put it to a group of kids that age, because you're all over the map when you're that age already, but she said, you notice when you're not nice to somebody, say you're talking behind somebody's back, you notice how you feel. It doesn't feel good. You know you're doing something wrong. That thing that's happening, that's Dharma. That's your gut telling you that this is not good. You don't like it when it happens to you. You don't want to do it to others. I think that's kind of one way of describing it. That as we become mature beings, we recognize when we're screwing up, doing something wrong. We can stop it. We can get into those 4 restraints and work with that. We just have to be alert to it. So, does that do it? Any other comments?
So, this is bringing up some, memories, kind of growing up a little bit. I grew up in that town that borders on Covington, where very well that body might have been buried. So it's hard to not kind of relocate me back to my own, hometown. Is very much, the cultural environment that I grew up in was much different than the one that I'm in here. And there's like a certain type, especially kind of growing up in high school, there's like this, or junior high school, there's this kind of need to put on some sort of like facade of toughness, and especially if you have a lot of people that are getting in fights with one another, or trying to be able to claim their territory in some way or shape or form. And I do kind of remember, and this was even sort of my, kind of growing up, and I was, supposed to get in this fight with this guy at the mall, and then, even my parents driving me to it. So it's like, this is what you do. You got a reputation, you stand up, you get there, you protect it, whether you win or, that would seem to me as very like, looking back at that now, it seems like, oh, that's an unwholesome thing to do, or like, oh, what a terrible thing for our parents. But it's also, you can also imagine the same thing that like, well, If you're a kid and you're not going there, then you do get walked on all over, right? It does end up defining you. And so even when you're kind of looking back there between that gap and that wholesomeness and that unwholesomeness, there might be some times where that gap is very, very blurred depending on the situation that you're in. I know if that situation arose right now, it would be very easy just to walk away because everyone's like, oh yeah, that's the enlightened thing to do. You go and walk away. Don't indulge toxic masculinity. Like all of those types of kind of things. It's like it's easy just because the social expectations are like, oh yeah, you look the other way and you walk away. But that's different depending on the different context that you're growing up in, where sometimes like that facade of toughness might seem like a skillful thing to do in a particular circumstance. So I'm wondering to what extent those lines between wholesomeness and unwholesomeness might be extremely blurred in the mental states of the people that you're talking about that you grew up with.
Maybe maybe I can answer it by talking a little bit more about Sam. He was a small guy. This was 1928. I mean, this is when banks were getting robbed all the time. And I'm sure that he felt like he had to seem tough. Part of this story, if you should read it, talks about he was a good student in school. He was artistic. He was curious about everything. I lived in his house. He had interesting books, interesting things everywhere. I just can't help but think that he didn't have the kind of guidance or peers to look up to, or not peers, but father figure or whatever. I have no idea about what his family life was like. I never heard much about that. So I'm thinking that considering those circumstances and the things he must have been going through, in that story, it talks about he being in the jail after they caught him with John Burns, talking tough. Like we're gonna take care of these guards. Actually, they were showing their guns apparently while they were in cell to the other guys, the other inmates. So I can't help but think that because of his abilities, his intelligence, he just didn't have the opportunities or anybody to show him there. Maybe that's where, our practice, our maturity can jump in and show somebody a better way. So, you're welcome. Is that it? Anybody else?
I'd ask a question. So I think in our culture being sort of fundamentally influenced by Christian thought, we have the notion that sort of once you do something like that, your soul is sort of permanently stained almost. Of course, there is redemption in Christianity too, but there's also that sort of piece, right? That if you do sort of a mortal sin or something, it's really hard to overcome. And Buddhism, of course, has some similarities with that, but takes a slightly different approach. I mean, generally at least early Buddhist conception is, you have this sort of almost infinitely long span of time in which you can make positive or negative karma. But also we have the idea of impermanence, so that we're always changing from moment to moment. So, the person that you are now is fundamentally different from who you were 10 years ago. That doesn't have that soul piece to kind of tie those two people together in the same way. So I'm curious if that has influenced your thoughts about Sam, and if so, how, and so forth. Just sort of like maybe thinking about that piece a little bit.
Well, Well, obviously, I'm not Christian, so.
But I mean, I guess with the Christian stuff, I mean, I think that even though most of us here probably don't identify as Christian, we still have that in our cultural baggage.
That's right.
So
That's
we
right.
still think like Christians in a lot of ways.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know how to answer that. I know how, I mean, I'm pretty solidly atheist these days. And growing up, my father made no secret of the fact that he just didn't believe. And, you know, of course, that colored the way I think about this, probably sent me in an odd way in this direction too. But I don't see, and I don't think Sam felt like he was going to be punished in hell forever. I think he, just judging by how he was, I think he felt great remorse for what he did. But I also think that he worked it out in his own way. Otherwise, how, you know, I just remember he was not a sad, he was not a remorseful guy. I mean, he didn't walk around in a dark cloud all the time. And he was quick to joke and quick to do, you know, to catch on to what was funny about things. So I don't know how else to think about it, except that I remember him stating a time or two about when I meet my maker. But I also like to think about the fluid nature of being is what made him grow up and be a decent human being, I think. None of us are stuck. There's always this point, this moment that we can start from. Did that do it?
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry.
First of all, it's just really moving to imagine this guy working it out in his own way somehow. Yeah. So that later in life, he was sort of unburdened, or seemingly unburdened. But I wanted to bring forward something that came from the Hoko's Wednesday night book discussion group, which, by the way, is going to start meeting in person on Wednesday nights for anyone who. All right. 6:30 on Wednesdays, but we're reading these commentaries, kind of quotes from Kodo Sawaki Roshi, and then commentaries by Uchiyama, and then a commentary by Hojo-san, all on Sawaki's words. And this past Wednesday, he was talking about Buddha nature and thief nature, and as sort of unwholesome and wholesome ways of potentials that are kind of like, we think of Buddha nature as kind of this something that is eternally there, but in our practice we manifest it. But the interesting thing was for Kodo Sawaki, it's like thief nature is also eternally there, and our actions are what manifest thief nature. So that there's some kind of, you can, if you rob a restaurant and kill somebody, you are manifesting 100% that thief nature or that action. But that Buddha nature is still reachable. It's still equally, eternally there, and that you can, in the next moment, manifest Buddha. That's kind of an extreme way of looking at it, because the karma is so heavy. But that kind of flexibility that exists between eternal thief nature, eternal Buddha nature, our actions manifesting, can be kind of a freeing thought, even as we have a sense of how heavy karma can be, unwholesome karma. So just to bring that forward from our discussion during the week.
Well, the possibility for greed, anger, and ignorance is always there. I think that's where, if we just actively engage in the restraints, recognize, it's all unwholesome on that end. We pick up things and put them in the tool chest. Hopefully we use the tools too. Lots of tools in Buddhism. That's I forgot about that part. I read that recently too. So interesting way to think about it. Thank you.
The thief nature, it reminded me, remember that television program back in the 70s, Kung Fu?
Yes.
And so David Carradine, he's a monk, and there's somebody sneaking around in the monastery, and he grabs something off stealing from the monastery, right? And David Carradine grabs the guy and says, "Master, I caught this thief." And then the master comes in and looks at the situation, and then takes an additional item off the altar and gives it to the thief and sends him on his way. There's a certain, so whenever I get morally condescending, which I often do because I'm just a very good person, I just consider that the conditions and circumstances which yield this behavior, if those were the same identical situations upon me, I might be behaving in the same exact way.
Yeah. I know.
If I had a nickel for every time a baby boomer mentioned the show Kung Fu,
Well, invest it.
Yeah, guilty as charged.
Would you like a nickel?
It was our only experience of Buddhism back then.
Well, it inspired me so much that shortly after I was ordained, I went to China and visited the Shaolin Temple.
Yeah.
I got a picture of myself there standing beside the sculpture of Bodhidharma.
Yeah. Does anybody else have a comment?
I haven't said anything, but your talk brought up tons and tons of things about the characters that affected my life and informed. I'm sure it's true for all of us, and so it was really provocative that way. And just what I was sort of landed on around the last set of input from the group were the struggles that I went through with many individuals and types during the Vietnam years, when I was essentially a pacifist and working really pretty hard in anti-war activities. And there are people who I knew so deeply who were in Vietnam or come back or were enlisting or et cetera, and having to make sense out of all of that, and not always live in an entirely black and white world of right and wrong. beginning of your talk about the practical reasons for being mindful enough to stay out of certain situations, because once you step in, then the normal, almost wholesome thing to do is shoot back,
Yeah.
or carry out the orders, or et cetera, and you wind up being somebody has killed and has witnessed and has supported and participated in this whole host of things, which are, of course, what you do.
Yeah.
You almost have to do.
Yeah.
And these are the same people who, back in the States, working with them, are perfectly, well, not perfectly good people, but they're imperfectly good people. Like
Yeah.
Justin.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm your age, somewhere around your age. I think I'm older than you, but I mean, I went through the same stuff. I decided in high school that I was pacifist too. I didn't entirely know what that meant. I think it's interesting to note, my dad fought in World War II. Never talked about it, except very, very little bit. Kind of got, the sense of where he was. He, of course, was terrified the whole time, and he didn't want to kill anybody, obviously. It's really a challenge to think about what war does to some folks. I mean, I have to say, I remember, again, my dad and I driving around, and I had just signed up for the draft, because you had to then. I think you still have to. Is that right? You don't have to? You still have to? Okay. So my dad was asking me, it's the summer after I graduated from high school, Dad was asking me, well, what are you going to do if they call your number? I said, well, I'm going to go to Canada. My dad said, good idea. And I always appreciate him for that. I mean, I have more than one friend and more than one relative that came back just thoroughly messed up. I don't know if I'd ever made it to this path if I'd gone there. I don't know if I'd made it back alive, of course, but yeah. And then to think of it in the scope of the modern world, what's going on now. So it's hard to resolve that. That's an unwholesomeness we don't need to dive into if we can help it.